It was the dead of winter, one of those freezing December nights when the cold stings your lungs, when I opened my front door and found my daughter standing on the porch. You and I both know how it feels when a single moment divides your life into a before and an after. The snow was already melting in Emily's hair, and my 3-year-old granddaughter Lily was shivering so hard she couldn't even manage a hello. Emily looked up at me with a hollow, haunted expression, whispering, "Dad, we don't have a home anymore." For a second I stood there, frozen. The wind swept another wave of white across the porch, and Lily buried her face deep into her mother's neck, her tiny pink boots dripping onto the faded welcome mat I bought back when my wife Carol was still alive. I just stepped aside and told them to get inside. A heavy, familiar rumble echoed from the basement as the old furnace roared to life, pushing warm air up through the floor vents to thaw us out. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, because I had spent the afternoon baking snickerdoodles, a December tradition my wife Carol started that I kept alive after she passed. I knelt down beside Lily, whose tiny hands were a frightening shade of purple from the biting cold. When I whispered, "Hey there, sweetheart," her lips trembled as she replied, "Hi, Grandpa." I gently took off her wet outer layers, wrapped her in a thick patchwork quilt Carol had hand-stitched years ago, and carried her to the sofa near the fireplace. Emily just stood there in the center of the room, shivering in her soaked coat as if she were a stranger. I looked at her and said softly, "Emily, take your coat off." Those simple words seemed to break whatever fragile dam was holding her together, and the tears finally began to spill over. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a silent, heavy weeping from carrying a burden for far too long. While she changed into one of Carol's old, oversized sweatshirts, I set some water on the stove to boil for hot chocolate. Within a few minutes, Lily was fast asleep on the sofa, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit she must have snatched on her way out. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into her mug for nearly 5 minutes before she finally broke the silence. She whispered that it all happened so fast, and I just waited, because I know people share the truth when you don't rush them. She rubbed her hands around the warm ceramic and explained that after dinner, Derek told her someone was coming over, a coworker she assumed, but then a woman walked in carrying a suitcase. With a knot tightening in my stomach, I listened as Emily told me how the woman had the nerve to look at her and smile. She paused to swallow hard, still haunted by that casual smirk. When she asked Derek what was going on, he simply introduced the woman as Claire. Emily let out a dry, humorless laugh, remembering how she initially thought it was all some twisted, elaborate joke. I could picture my son-in-law perfectly, wearing that smug grin he always had when he thought he was the smartest man in the room. But the joke ended when his mother, Nancy Collins, a woman whose very name makes my chest tighten, walked into the kitchen. Nancy looked at Claire, turned to Emily, and coldly said that she should start packing her bags before the night got too late. Emily just shook her head, unable to comprehend the sheer cruelty of it. In the heavy silence that followed, Emily realized no one was laughing, and the only sound in the house was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Nancy went upstairs and returned minutes later with large black contractor trash bags, immediately starting to fold Emily's clothes. My daughter's voice cracked with emotion as she recalled watching her sweaters, Lily's tiny pajamas, and even their holiday decorations get stuffed away. She glanced at her sleeping daughter and asked if I remembered the ornaments Lily had crafted at preschool, and I nodded, my heart aching, as she confirmed Nancy took those down too. My late wife Carol always believed that holiday ornaments held memories more deeply than any old photograph, but Nancy clearly had no soul. When Emily confronted Derek, he coldly announced that Claire was moving in right after Christmas, wearing a sickening smile. A cold, hard knot twisted deep in my chest as Emily described the moment Derek decided there was no point in waiting. He walked over and unplugged the Christmas tree, plunging their festive living room into sudden, bleak darkness. Lily had looked up with wide eyes and asked why her daddy was turning Christmas off. For several seconds, neither Emily nor I could find any words to say. When I finally asked what Claire was doing during all of this, Emily told me she just stood there silently, like a guest waiting for a hotel maid to finish cleaning the room. Nancy packed up their entire lives, clothes, toys, and toiletries, even folding Emily's winter scarf. I could almost hear Carol's voice in my head reminding me that some people mistake cruelty for strength. When Emily refused to move, Derek simply grabbed the heavy bags. Without a shred of hesitation, Derek hauled the heavy trash bags out into the freezing night. Nancy followed behind, carrying Lily's winter coat, while the snow outside began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. As we both watched the flakes drift past my living room window, Emily recalled how Lily had innocently asked if they were going somewhere fun. Derek threw the front door wide open, letting the icy wind whip snow straight into the entryway, and dumped their belongings onto the porch. He looked Emily dead in the eye and said that Claire deserved a fresh start, a comment that made my jaw clench in pure fury. He held the door open, forcing Emily to scoop up Lily and step out into the storm, and she heard the heavy deadbolt click shut before she even reached the sidewalk. Watching the fireplace embers, I listened to Lily softly mumble in her sleep. With a trembling voice, Emily shared the final, painful detail of that night, how my granddaughter had knocked on the door one last time, calling out for her daddy. He never answered. A heavy silence settled over my living room as the furnace finally shut off, leaving only the quiet hum of the night. I stood up, grabbed my truck keys off the counter, and headed toward the garage, with Emily rushing after me, asking where on earth I was going. Honestly, I didn't have an answer as I opened the driver's side door. Part of me wanted to race over to Derek's house, drag him out of bed and make him freeze in the snow just like he did to my girls. Instead, I found myself driving aimlessly through the streets of Fort Wayne, eventually pulling into the empty, snow-covered parking lot of the little church Carol and I had attended for over 30 years. Sitting in the quiet dark of my truck, I gripped the steering wheel for 10 minutes until my knuckles turned white and my fingers began to ache. That was when I heard Carol's voice in my head, just like I always do when I am right on the verge of making a terrible mistake. She used to tell me that if anger makes your first decision, regret will almost certainly make your last one. I rested my forehead against the wheel, took a deep breath, and finally drove back home as the eastern sky was turning a cold, pale gray. Finding Emily and Lily fast asleep, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat alone in the kitchen until sunrise. I wasn't plotting some foolish revenge, I was figuring out how to protect them, because Derek's arrogance made no sense unless someone had lied to him or broken the law. By Monday, we began adjusting to our new reality. To handle the fallout of that night, Emily requested a temporary leave of absence from her position teaching 4th grade at Maple Creek Elementary. She told the administration she was facing a sudden family emergency, and since they had known her for years, they graciously granted it without prying. Surprisingly, little Lily adapted to the change much faster than either of us adults did. Within just a few days, she had claimed my favorite leather recliner as our reading spot, lined up her stuffed animals along the sofa, and declared that the guest room belonged to both of us now. Under normal circumstances, her sweet energy would have brought a smile to my face, but instead it was a constant aching proof of the cruelty that had driven them out in the first place. One morning before dawn, I found Emily staring blankly out the kitchen window, with a cold mug of coffee, looking exhausted. As she watched the darkness fade outside, Emily admitted she kept expecting to wake up in her own bed, only to realize the nightmare was real. She sighed, wondering aloud if she should have seen this betrayal coming all along. I walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her that if anyone should have noticed the warning signs, it was me. Emily frowned, reminding me that Derek had always seemed like a decent partner on paper. After all, the man she married was a regional sales manager for a major building supply company, not some shiftless deadbeat. He wore pressed shirts, coached Little League over the summers, and never missed a birthday. Yet looking back, the subtle red flags were always there. He completely locked her out of their finances, insisted on opening all the mail, and always brushed off her financial questions by claiming he had it all covered. Rather than rushing to find a lawyer that afternoon, I decided to make a single strategic phone call first. My old friend, Harold Benson, picked up on the second ring, joking and asking if Jack Morgan was still among the living. I chuckled dryly, telling him I was barely hanging on and needed a serious favor. Harold had retired from Allen County Title nearly 3 years ago, and we first crossed paths decades earlier when I put a new heating system in his building. Since then, we kept a steady routine of grabbing coffee at a diner off Coldwater Road every few months. When I told him I needed to find out who actually owned my daughter's property, the line went dead silent before he muttered, "Come see me." An hour later, I found him at our usual breakfast spot, sporting his signature gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses, endlessly stirring a cup of coffee that was already sweet enough. We ordered some basic breakfast food, and then I laid out every single agonizing detail of what had happened to my family. Harold sat there listening intently, without saying a single word, until I finished speaking. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and asked me for the address. He walked away to make a few phone calls, and when he returned 15 minutes later, the relaxed look on his face was completely gone. He revealed that the deed hadn't changed, meaning Emily was still fully listed as a legal co-owner. You and I know that in times of absolute darkness, even a tiny spark of truth is enough to start fighting back. Harold looked at me, lowering his voice, and said that this wasn't just cruelty, it was a highly illegal eviction, and suddenly I felt hope. At the end of the day, facts do not care about who has the loudest voice or the biggest ego. Harold tapped his knuckles against the wood of his desk and looked me in the eye. "Jack," he said, "either your son-in-law has no clue how the law works, or he thinks the rest of us are completely blind." That warning stayed with me. During my drive home, I called Emily and told her to avoid signing anything. She agreed, but told me Derek had already texted claiming the house was his and warning that lawyers would only make this expensive. I actually laughed. Emily was surprised, but I told her that people who actually hold all the cards do not feel the need to shout about it from the rooftops. We spent the next few days gathering whatever financial trail we could find. Emily brought over a box of unopened mail tax returns, insurance documents, and bank notices she had never looked at because Derek always insisted on handling the bills. Once my granddaughter Lily was fast asleep, we spread the paper trail across my dining room table. My daughter looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered that she felt stupid for trusting him. I told her she had simply trusted her marriage, and those are two very different things. The next morning, we took those papers to Sandra Whitaker, a sharp, no-nonsense family law attorney downtown. She sat with us, listened quietly for nearly an hour, and slowly began to piece together the puzzle. When Sandra addressed her as Mrs. Collins, my daughter gently corrected her, explaining that she was reclaiming her maiden name, Morgan. The attorney nodded with a faint, supportive smile and asked for absolute honesty. As Sandra quietly reviewed the mountain of financial documents, her pen scratched against her legal pad. Suddenly, her movements stopped. She compared two different bank statements and noted that the mortgage balance did not make any sense because the loan amount had somehow increased. Emily insisted she had never refinanced, but when Sandra turned a page toward us showing a signature that claimed to be my daughter's, Emily went pale. She looked at me, her voice trembling, and whispered that she had never signed that paper. A heavy silence filled the office as Sandra slowly nodded, confirming she did not believe the signature was authentic either. She looked over at me and asked if my daughter had ever filed a report for identity theft. I told her no, and she warned us that forged mortgage documents were not just a domestic issue, they were a serious criminal matter. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. It was Derek. I answered with a cold greeting, only to hear his familiar, arrogant voice telling me to convince Emily to stop wasting everyone's time because she had zero chance. I kept my voice flat, telling him that I was not going to tell her any such thing and that I understood the situation far better than he realized. Staring through my windshield at the overcast Indiana sky, I simply asked him if he was really sure about that. Derek barked that he knew exactly what he owned before hanging up. For a long time, I sat in the cab of my truck fighting the urge to drive to his office and confront him face to face. Instead, I went home, brewed a hot pot of coffee, and began organizing our evidence by date, remembering how my late wife Carol always said, big problems only get solved one small step at a time. 3 days later, Sandra called me and told me to sit down. The bank had uncovered another refinance document, and my stomach knotted when she told me who had witnessed the forgery. Derek's own mother, Nancy. It became sickeningly clear that Nancy had not just encouraged her son's behavior, she had actively helped him execute the deception. The terrible night Emily had been locked out in the freezing cold was not a sudden emotional outburst. It was the calculated conclusion of a plan they had engineered over several months. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, 6 inches of fresh snow covered the streets, making the neighborhood look like a perfect holiday card. Inside my home, though, the atmosphere was heavy. My granddaughter Lily stood by the window in her red pajamas, watching the falling snow. She softly asked if Santa would still be able to find her now that she lived with me, and I knelt down next to her, offering a reassuring smile. To ease her worries, I whispered that Santa has been doing this job for an incredibly long time, even longer than her old grandpa. Lily let out a small, precious giggle, saying she did not think anyone could possibly be older than me. That sweet moment even brought a brief laugh to Emily's face, the first genuine smile I had seen from my daughter in what felt like an eternity. We did our best to make the holiday feel normal, baking sugar cookies using Carol's old recipe, and letting Lily cover them in sprinkles. For a brief moment, with Christmas music playing softly on the kitchen radio, life felt peaceful again. But then Emily's phone buzzed, and the color instantly drained from her face. On her screen was a photo of Derek Nancy and his new partner Claire, posing happily in front of the very Christmas tree Emily had spent hours decorating with Lily. Claire was even wearing the green sweater Emily's sister had gifted her 2 years ago. Underneath, Nancy had written a caption about how wonderful it was to spend the holidays with the people who truly belong together. It already had nearly 200 likes and dozens of comments. My jaw clenched in anger as Emily quietly took her phone back and retreated into the hallway. Within moments, I heard the faint, muffled sound of her weeping. It was a quiet, heartbreaking cry, the sound of a daughter trying to hide her pain from her father. Later that afternoon, Lily looked up from her coloring books and suddenly realized her favorite stuffed bedtime rabbit was missing. Emily and I froze, realizing in an instant that the toy had been left behind in the rush to leave Derek's house. Lily's small face crumpled, and she whimpered that she could not sleep without her bunny. I grabbed my coat immediately, telling Emily I would handle it despite her protests. The drive across Fort Wayne took about 20 minutes through neighborhoods bright with festive lights. When I arrived at Derek's house, it was lit up like a Christmas tree, with at least 9 cars parked along the street. The entire Collins clan was clearly inside celebrating their holiday. I parked half a block away and took a deep breath, grabbing a backup stuffed rabbit I had bought for Lily years ago, just in case they refused to return her real one. Walking up to the porch, I could hear the sounds of loud laughter and festive music echoing from inside. When I knocked, the noise suddenly died down. Nancy opened the door, her initial shock quickly melting into a smug, triumphant smirk. I kept my composure, wished her a Merry Christmas, and told her I was there to pick up Lily's rabbit. She leaned against the doorframe, pretending she had no idea what I was talking about. But before she could play dumb any longer, Derek stepped up behind her and demanded to know what was going on. His smug expression vanished instantly when he saw my face. When I explained that my 3-year-old granddaughter just wanted her favorite toy back, he merely shrugged in response. Claire stepped into the hallway, looking visibly uncomfortable and entirely different from the arrogant woman Emily had described to me. Nancy crossed her arms and told me that she thought we had taken enough, accusing us of wallowing in a pity party for the last 2 weeks. I looked her dead in the eye and reminded her that it was Christmas Eve and I was simply asking for a child's toy. As she opened her mouth to argue, a young boy ran past carelessly, tossing Lily's dirty, half-torn stuffed rabbit across the room. The little boy complained that the toy smelled funny, causing Claire to look absolutely horrified. She picked the rabbit up from the floor, brushed the dirt off it, and walked over to hand it to me in silence. I thanked her, and she gave me a quiet nod, while Derek rolled his eyes in the background, asking if we could finally be done. I tucked the doll inside my coat and looked around the room at the 15 or so relatives watching us. Some looked away, clearly embarrassed by the cruelty on display. Nobody stood up to defend what they had done. When Nancy sneered and asked if I had finally accepted reality, I just smiled, realizing that people who act like monsters in private always expect a round of applause. When she asked what I meant, I simply told her that the truth usually arrives a little later than the lie. The room went silent, and even Derek looked utterly baffled as I tipped my hat, wished them a Merry Christmas, and walked away without uttering a single threat. As I walked down the driveway, I heard their mocking laughter behind me, but I did not bother looking back. Back at my house, Lily hugged her worn-out rabbit so tightly I thought she would never let go. As Emily sat on the sofa, quietly stitching the torn ear back together, while Lily watched cartoons, her eyes filled with tears. Watching my daughter repair that little toy broke my heart more than anything else that long, difficult week. 3 days after Christmas, on December 27th, I was standing on a stepladder in my cold garage trying to swap out a burned-out light bulb when my phone rang. It was Sandra, our lawyer, telling me to get to her office right away. An hour later, I was staring at two certified envelopes she had placed on her desk, one from the mortgage company, the other from the county prosecutor. When I asked her what happened, she told me the bank had finished its preliminary review and found enough irregularities to start a formal fraud investigation. Before I could even speak, Sandra slid another paper toward me, quietly explaining that they had subpoenaed Claire, but Claire had quickly hired her own attorney. Sandra gave me a long, quiet look before revealing that Derek had told Claire he was already divorced. I just blinked in disbelief. He was still very much married, and Sandra let out a dry laugh, adding that he had not even filed the paperwork yet. That was the moment I realized Derek had not just betrayed my daughter, Emily. He had built his entire new life on a foundation of absolute lies, and now that the first card was falling, the rest were sure to follow. By the time January bled into February, I had learned a bitter truth about the legal system. Television makes you think justice is won with one dramatic courtroom speech, but real life is just piles of endless paperwork and cold coffee in quiet waiting rooms. Real life is signing your name on document after document until your hand cramps and paying heavy attorney bills that make your stomach drop. It is waking up every morning hoping that nobody has given up on you. Those hard winter months tested our strength. Emily began seeing a therapist every Wednesday afternoon, though she fought it at first, claiming she did not need counseling, she just wanted her old life back. I handed her a dish to dry and told her that sometimes those two things go together. Eventually, she admitted the sessions were helping. They could not erase what had happened, but they did help her stop blaming herself for Derek's actions, and that was a massive step. My granddaughter Lily had her own silent ways of processing the fear. I remember the afternoon I accidentally slammed the front door while carrying in groceries, and she screamed a sound of pure terror. She dropped her coloring book on the floor and bolted straight under the dining room table. Emily immediately rushed over and crawled underneath to hold her while I kept my distance, knowing a little girl needs her mother most in moments like that. When Lily finally whispered something, Emily looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, explaining that Lily thought we were being thrown out of our home again. I had to walk out onto the porch, letting the freezing February wind hit my face. It broke my heart that a 3-year-old was living in fear of a closing door. Meanwhile, the legal machine ground forward at a painful pace, with Sandra calling us almost every week with endless updates and even more delays. On a Tuesday afternoon, she brought us into her office to prepare us for some tough news. Derek had hired a new lawyer named Michael Grayson, a heavy-hitting civil attorney in Fort Wayne. I knew the name immediately and knew he was incredibly expensive. Sandra did not sugarcoat it. She told us he was exceptionally good at what he did. I watched Emily's shoulders sag as she asked if we were going to lose this battle. Sandra looked at her and said no, but it meant we were in for a long, brutal fight. She was not wrong. Within 2 weeks, things got incredibly messy. Grayson's strategy was simple and ruthless. He claimed Emily had signed everything voluntarily, and if she did not remember, that was her own fault. He even suggested she was just irresponsible with finances. Reading those legal claims made my blood boil, and Emily looked absolutely devastated, fearing people would believe him. I squeezed her hand tightly, reminding her that courtrooms look at evidence, not popularity. But the truth was, we still did not have enough hard proof. The expert believed the signature was forged but could not prove it, and the bank only suspected fraud. Sandra, however, remained calm, reminding us that patience wins cases. I offered Sandra a weak smile, confessing I was hoping for an easier path, and she just laughed softly. A few days later, I almost ruined our entire case. I was at Miller's grocery store grabbing some milk and dog food when I spotted Derek near the cash registers, laughing with a friend as if he had not destroyed his family. He saw me and had the nerve to smirk and give me a little wave. Rage blinded me. 1 second I was looking at frozen food, and the next I was standing 10 feet from him. He asked if I was doing okay, still wearing that arrogant smile. For one terrifying second, I wanted to grab him by his expensive winter coat and ask how he could throw his own flesh and blood out into the freezing snow. Instead of acting on my anger, I heard my late wife Carol's voice in my head. It was just an old memory of her, reminding me after a bad day at work decades ago that the moment you lose your temper, you give all your power to the other person. I walked out of the store, leaving my shopping cart behind, my hands trembling all the way home. When I confessed to Emily that night that I had almost hit Derek, she looked at me quietly and said she was glad I had not, and I agreed. When March rolled in, with muddy streets and melting snow, Sandra called us back to her office, her voice filled with curiosity rather than worry. When we arrived, there was another woman waiting for us in the room. The woman stood up as we walked in, and it took me a second to realize it was Claire. She looked completely drained, with no makeup and her hair pulled back, nothing like the smiling woman from those Christmas photos. Sitting beside her lawyer, Claire looked straight at Emily and apologized. Emily did not say a word, and Claire just nodded, expecting that silence. She opened a thick envelope and pulled out bank transfers, text messages, and emails, which Sandra began sorting through in silence. Claire confessed she was not there because she had suddenly become a saint, but because she realized Derek had been playing her for a fool, too, lying about everything from the start. Claire kept her head down, admitting she believed him when he said he was divorced and that the money came from an investment sale. Her attorney spoke up to state that his client was cooperating fully and understood she had received no legal counsel from Mr. Collins. Sandra nodded her head. When Claire looked at Emily and admitted she should have asked more questions, Emily quietly agreed. There was no screaming, just two women sharing a room. One carrying deep wounds, the other carrying regret. 3 days later, Sandra called me again, skipping the small talk entirely to tell me they had issued the warrant. The prosecutor had authorized charges of mortgage fraud and forgery. I closed my eyes as a wave of relief washed over me. After months of endless waiting, self-doubt, and wondering if the truth even mattered anymore, we finally had our answer. That very evening, right after dinner, Emily called me, crying tears of relief as she told me they had arrested him. Looking out my kitchen window at the first robins of spring, I felt the cold grip of that bitter December night finally begin to lift. By early May, Fort Wayne had come back to life, with the trees turning a vibrant green and the bitter winter cold replaced by warm mornings and the sweet smell of freshly cut grass. It was strange to watch the rest of the world move on so easily while we were still trying to rebuild our lives. The criminal charges and the divorce had split into two separate legal battles. Derek's high-priced attorney fought us tooth and nail, but the handwriting evidence, bank records, and Claire's testimony made the fraud impossible to deny. Sandra warned us to stay grounded, reminding us that cases are won by evidence, not confidence. Our temporary custody and financial hearing was set for a Tuesday morning at the Allen County Courthouse. Emily did not sleep a wink, and by 6 o'clock that morning, I found her wrapped in a blanket on the back porch, staring at Lily's little tricycle. Emily cleared her throat and asked what would happen if she froze or forgot details on the stand. I sat beside her, assuring her she would be fine and that she did not need to be perfect, just honest. When she whispered how much she wished her mother were here, a lump formed in my throat, but I managed to smile and said Carol would probably tell us to stop worrying and eat some breakfast. That made Emily laugh through her tears, and it felt like a tiny victory. A few hours later, the parking garage at the courthouse was already packed with nervous-looking people carrying briefcases and coffee cups, all rushing toward the entrance. We took a deep breath and prepared to face the day. Walking into that waiting room, I saw some faces twisted in anger, while others just looked completely drained. Family court is never a place where you'll find people celebrating the best day of their lives, and you and I can both feel that heavy weight. After security slid our phones through the scanner, we stepped into a hallway buzzing with anxious whispers. That was when I spotted them. Nancy was by the window in a navy suit, wearing enough perfume to smell from 15 feet away. Derek stood by his lawyer, looking thinner and missing his expensive watch. Our eyes met for a second before he looked away first, telling me more than words ever could. At 9 o'clock, the judge entered, and the room quickly settled into the steady rhythm of legal arguments. Our lawyer Sandra laid out the chronological sequence of events with absolute precision. There were no cheap dramatics, just an undeniable mountain of facts: property deeds, bank statements, phone bills, emails, and certified handwriting reports. Each piece locked into place like a perfect puzzle. Derek's attorney, Grayson, desperately challenged every detail he could, questioning dates and memories. But solid facts have a stubborn way of surviving under fire. Then my daughter Emily took the stand, and my heart swelled with immense pride. She kept her composure, speaking simply and truthfully without any exaggeration. When Sandra gently asked what happened on December 12th, Emily took a slow, steady breath and told the court that her husband had brought another woman into their home. When asked what followed, Emily testified that Nancy began shoving their lives into plastic garbage bags. After that, Derek locked the heavy front door behind them, shutting them out in the cold. Sandra paused to let that sink in, then asked who was with her. My daughter replied that her little girl was there. When asked how old she was, Emily said she was only 3. The entire courtroom went dead silent. Emily looked down, her voice barely a whisper as she explained how Lily had knocked on the door, crying out for her daddy. That silence stretched so long you could hear a paper rustle in the back. Even the judge took off his glasses. Later that afternoon, Claire took the stand, explaining she wasn't there for revenge or out of some sudden friendship with Emily. Instead, Claire took the stand because she had finally realized she was just another victim of Derek's elaborate lies. Her lawyer had secured limited immunity regarding the financial transactions which investigators agreed she had been dragged into without her knowledge. When Sandra asked what Derek told her before she moved in, Claire answered clearly that he claimed to be divorced. But there were no papers filed. She didn't know Emily still owned the house, and she had no clue the refinance documents had a forged signature. Grayson tried to paint her as a liar, trying to save her own skin, but Claire didn't fight back. She just quietly admitted her mistakes, saying she should have asked more questions. It wasn't dramatic, just the sound of a woman facing her own blind spots. Her quiet humility made her incredibly credible, which clearly pushed Nancy over the edge. Without being asked, Nancy suddenly leaned forward from the gallery and loudly interrupted Sandra's questioning, calling the whole thing ridiculous. Judge Martinez stared over his glasses calmly, telling her she would get her turn if it became appropriate, but she completely ignored him. She cleared her throat and barked that her son had worked for everything he owned. The judge didn't raise his voice, but his warning was razor sharp. One more interruption and security would throw her out. She finally slumped back into her seat, her face burning with rage. For once, Nancy wasn't pulling the strings. The room had completely moved on without her. By late afternoon, we finally got our first set of temporary rulings. Under the temporary orders, Emily was awarded primary residential custody of Lily while the divorce proceeded. She was also granted exclusive possession of their home until the final property division was settled, and Derek was ordered to keep paying financial support. On top of that, the judge pointed out the heavy evidence of mortgage fraud, noting those serious allegations would play out separately in criminal court. It wasn't the final victory, but it was a massive hurdle cleared. Best of all, my daughter didn't have to carry the agonizing weight of wondering if anyone believed her anymore. The court did. As we walked out of the courthouse, a swarm of local reporters was already waiting by the steps, their microphones thrust forward, because the fraud angle had turned this into a major local story. As a reporter approached Nancy for a comment on the judge's ruling, she suddenly whipped around and pointed her finger right at me. She hissed that I was the old man who had ruined their family, making several cameras pivot in my direction. For a brief heartbeat, I thought about keeping my mouth shut, but then the image of little Lily shivering out in the snow flashed in my mind. I stepped forward and looked Nancy dead in the eye, keeping my voice perfectly level. I told her that she was the one who destroyed her own family the night she locked her 3-year-old granddaughter outside in the dead of winter. Nobody spoke up to defend her. Even the press lowered their mics in the heavy silence. In the weeks that followed, a quiet peace settled over us, and Emily began to smile again. Emily eventually got back to teaching part-time, and Lily stopped asking if she'd be forced to leave my house. Then, on a warm Friday afternoon while I was finishing up with the tomato plants in my backyard, I saw a familiar old pickup truck slowly pulling into my gravel driveway. It was Derek. He shut off the engine and just sat behind the wheel for almost a whole minute before opening the door. When he finally stepped out, there was no lawyer beside him, no overbearing mother, and no audience to perform for. I had absolutely no clue what he wanted, but I had a strong feeling this encounter was going to be completely different from our past confrontations. He just stood there by his truck under the gentle Indiana sun, on a spring day so beautiful it made you forget how harsh the winter had been. Resting near the freshly turned soil of my garden bed was Lily's small pink watering can, still half filled from when she insisted on helping me. Life was starting to feel wonderfully normal again, and I had learned the hard way never to take those quiet, ordinary moments for granted. Derek began walking toward me with slow, hesitant steps. He looked much older, not from gray hair, but from the crushing weight of everything he'd been through. Gone were the flashy clothes and shiny dress shoes. Instead, he wore scuffed work boots, and his shoulders slumped heavily. He spoke my name, Jack, and I set my trowel down. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity before he complimented the yard, admitted he didn't know how to start, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. Derek admitted he had rehearsed our conversation 100 times in his head, though every single draft ended up sounding incredibly selfish. Crossing my arms, I told him not to make it about himself. He nodded in agreement, staring down at the grass, before admitting he had turned into someone he wouldn't have respected 10 years ago. I stayed silent as he explained how he'd convinced himself Emily would be fine, and how he'd started believing his own lies, even telling himself Lily was too young to remember. I glanced over at the wooden swing set I had built for her during the freezing winter. When I told him she remembers far more than he thinks, his face fell. He quietly mentioned his therapist had said the same, which caught me off guard, and made me ask if he was actually getting help. A bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaped him as he confessed he originally started therapy just to make his court case look better. But along the way, he realized how badly he actually needed it. For the first time, I saw real shame in his eyes, not the usual fear or arrogance, but genuine remorse. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, explaining it was a letter for Emily that he didn't expect me to read. I took it, keeping it folded, and told him she would be the one to decide its fate. He understood, noting he had driven past my house 3 times before gathering the courage to pull in. I admitted I'd seen his truck, and when he weakly joked that I notice everything, I told him I've just had plenty of practice. We both knew age makes you pay attention. Paying close attention is a habit that comes with age, acting sometimes as a quiet gift and other times as a heavy burden. Derek rubbed his neck and quietly admitted he had lost his job due to the bad publicity of the fraud charges. I gave a single nod, recognizing he wasn't begging for sympathy, but simply laying out facts. He mentioned Claire had left for Michigan, and I told him I'd heard that too, noticing the total lack of bitterness in his voice. When he confessed his mother still blamed me for everything, I couldn't help but smile and ask him what he thought. He looked directly at me and said Nancy had to blame me because accepting the truth meant realizing she had destroyed her own family. It was easily the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. A gentle spring breeze rustled through the green leaves of the maple tree in my backyard as the distant drone of a lawnmower drifted over the fence. Life keeps moving forward, and you and I both know it never waits for us to heal. Derek cleared his throat, admitting he came to be a better father, not for the court or his lawyer, but because he hears Lily knocking on that door every night. He closed his eyes, knowing she would carry that sound forever. I let the silence hang, then told him he couldn't change that terrible night, but he could choose whether it remains the absolute worst thing she remembers about him. He stared at me, asking what I meant, and in his eyes I saw a father finally willing to do the hard work of earning his daughter's trust back. I looked him in the eye and told him he had to spend the next 10 years showing up. No missing birthdays, no canceling weekends for something better. He had to tell the truth and pay his child support without complaining. I stepped closer, reminding him that while he was no longer my son-in-law, he would always be Lily's father. The kind of parent he became now was his decision alone. He nodded, eyes filling with tears, and thanked me. I told him I was not looking for thanks. I was giving him a duty. When he offered his hand, I hesitated, but then I shook it. Not because everything was forgiven, but because anger had already cost us too much. Settling back into his truck, he rolled down the window before turning the key in the ignition. He told me he would spend the rest of his life wishing he could take that night back. I told him I believed him, but wishing was not the same as changing, which he quietly admitted was true. After his truck disappeared around the corner, my granddaughter Lily ran outside, wearing oversized gardening gloves, holding a packet of sunflower seeds, and asking if we could plant them. I smiled and said we surely could. Emily followed with iced tea, looked at the empty driveway, and asked if that was Derek. When she asked what he wanted, I simply said he wanted a second chance, and she did not ask if I had given him one. Emily already understood that second chances are not gifts handed to you, but opportunities you must earn. As the summer went on, our lives slowly fell into a peaceful new rhythm. She finalized the divorce, and after the old house was sold under court supervision and the debts were settled, she received her fair share of the money. She used it to put a down payment on a cozy townhouse only 15 minutes away from my place. By August, she was back to teaching full-time, and her students absolutely loved her. Lily started preschool, her nightmares faded away, and on weekends she still helped me tend the garden, watching the tomatoes ripen and the sunflowers grow taller than her. It was on a warm Saturday when I watched Lily ride her bicycle down my driveway without training wheels for the first time, looking back to shout that she did it. I laughed until my eyes watered, realizing how wrong I had been to define victory by courtroom battles or legal consequences. True victory was this simple moment, a little girl laughing in the sun without fear, and a daughter smiling because she finally believed in tomorrow. Getting older has taught me that real justice is not about destroying an enemy, but protecting the ones you love from cruelty. If you have ever had to stand between your family and someone who crossed the line, I would love to hear your story. May you and yours always find your way back to peace.